Hello, World History, and welcome to the first of the pre-recorded digital lectures. So this is how I'm going to do this going forward with lectures. We'll probably have 1 to 2 of these max per week. This is just an opportunity for me to not have to redo the same lecture over and over again, especially since we have the opportunity where we don't have to do this. And this way, instead of having to make me pause in an individual classroom, you will all be able to pause your own version of this lecture, so that way you guys can work at your necessary pace. So this one is called The Story So Far. It is a very fast, very limited review of just some key information from prehistory to the early modern era. So this is basically just re-hitting the highlights from 6th and 7th grade to kind of get you guys right back up to speed here. So you can either follow along with me, or you can do your own lecture. So the directions, guys, are real simple. There are 10 slides of information here, not including the title slides. For each one, I want you to take 2 notes, and the total 20 notes is going to be worth 10 points. So I'm giving you a half point per note because it's notes, guys. Okay, this one's not a super difficult activity, so I want you to follow along. Please remember, guys, this is not comprehensive. We're just doing some of the highlights, and I'm going to make some comments and connections to, hey, this matters because, and I'm going to bring up things that we're going to talk about going forward in modern world history. So we got 3 distinct periods of time that I'm going to cover here. Now there are more subdivisions of time. I just picked these 3 specific ones to make things relatively easy for you guys. So you notice on your text note sheet, you have 3 things where it says, section title. So this would be the first one, prehistory. We call it this because it's the era before a full historical record. So it begins before writing itself does, and it essentially ends when we get the first really comprehensive historical records, both in the West, in Greece, and in the East with China. So, for those who don't remember, early man, when we first start out some 200,000 years ago, what we would call proper humans, we were hunter-gatherers. So we start out in family groups, and the periods from, say, 200,000 years ago to about 10 to 20,000 years ago, we see these massive waves of migration as the human race, which started in Central East Africa, basically just explodes outward across the world. First, we move into Asia and Europe, and then from there we spread to places like Australia and the Americas by both boat and frozen land bridges over different periods of time of global warming, global cooling. Now, these early people originally moved, as far as we can tell, because remember, this is prehistory, so this is all archaeology and logical guesses. From what we can tell, people moved originally in family groups, right? Makes sense. The family are people you can rely on. But over time, we start to see these extended families, right, like cousins and things like that, grouped together into clans. And then eventually we see numbers of different clans who have much more distant blood ties get together, and we get tribes. So we see already this tendency of the human race to collectivize and to group into larger and larger amounts. Now the reason for that is, of course, the more people you have, the more labor you get, because if you have 100 hunters, that's 100 different people bringing in food. Same thing with gatherers. And it also means protection, because if you run into a clan or tribe that is not related to you and has no emotional connection to you, they are a potential threat. So we already see these kind of early patterns of behavior of how we like to group together for protection and economic benefit. Now, over hundreds of thousands of years, this collectivization keeps going and going until we have a couple things happen. Now, the argument of which one's first is academic and isn't really relevant here for this class, but we get the development of agriculture, which allows people to settle, meaning they don't have to move to follow herds of animals or to, gather crops and then come back a year later when everything is grown back. Instead, they learn how to deliberately plant foods in the same spot and produce crop after crop every season. Now, this creates the first small villages, and from small villages, we eventually get the first cities. And again, we see this grouping together of people. This is going to be a common thread here. So with that, we see the emergence of a new type of person. Now, in the previous ones, you might have something like the elders in charge, or the most experienced or most talented. But with the first big cities, we now get the first kings. And with the emergence of kings, we also see the emergence of two things that are going to be very important for us in the modern world: trade and warfare. I especially like to bring this up because it's often kind of this belief of people that the way we think of trade, of these massive cities, states, and countries trading with each other or going to war with each other, is a relatively modern thing. And that's really not the case at all. We get these first major civilizations in China, India, and the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent's that picture in the bottom left here. You can see my mouse flipping around. And that is where we have Egypt and Mesopotamia. Now, from there we move to the ancient era. So we've now established these cities, we've established kings, we get the first empires. So we now have this world full of trade and warfare and conquering. So moving into the ancient era, we see the development of writing, we see global systems. True writing appears around 3000 BCE, so that's about 5,000 years ago. And by the way, BCE, guys, means before the Common Era. So it's essentially the same thing as BC. It just acknowledges that not everybody in the world is Christian. This is when we see the first true armies, and we are going to talk about armies a lot, especially in second semester. So again, it's important to know that what we see in the modern world, guys, is not unique per se. It just looks different, right? We go back 5,000 years and we see large armies, we see international trade, we see conquest. But the fact of it is not new, but the way it's going to look is going to be different. We see early global trade. We see the first ships, not just dinky little fishing boats, but first true ships that can cross entire seas and entire oceans in the case of, say, some of the Pacific Islanders. All right. One thing that's going to be critical for us in our discussion, because modern world history does focus a lot on Europe and the West, is the legacy of Greece and why the Mediterranean matters. So in Greece, we have these city-states that develop a couple things. Critically, one is democracy. That's going to be a big theme when we talk about the French Revolution and its ideas deeply inspired by the Greeks. We'll also see all kinds of philosophy, medicine, science, math, art, architecture, theater, all these things that are still with us to this day. When you guys decide what movie to watch, do you want to watch something that's funny? Well, it's called a comedy because that's what it was called in Greece. Or do you want to watch something that's going to make you all depressed? That's called a drama because that's the Greek term. So we see this. We also see the first histories in the West written. Now, it is important to note that we do have the Greek civilization, and we'll eventually get to the Roman Empire in the West, but up until really the time that we're going to start covering when we move on to Unit 3 in the Industrial Revolution, it's very critical to understand that most of the world's wealth was not actually in Europe. Europe was, generally speaking, except for a brief period of Roman dominance, Europe was usually kind of the poor cousin to other powerful empires, especially the Chinese empires. So we see them rise. We also see the rise of Buddhism, one of the world's greatest religions. If I recall correctly, I believe Buddhism is technically the largest religion in the world. It has the most practitioners. We have Rome, of course. The main thing that we care about with Rome in terms of why it matters to modern world history is it did two things. It spread Christianity. Christianity was not a Roman religion originally, but it was adopted into Rome, and Rome's massive trade and road network and its wars of expansion spread Christianity in its later centuries. And the other big thing for us is that when the Roman Empire collapses, the Western Europe, or sorry, the European world fractures into a bunch of different territories that become independent kingdoms, which leads us to the medieval era. The medieval era matters to us because of the major kingdoms that are going to be the important players in our units, our coursework this year. This is when they emerge. With the collapse of Rome, we have the emergence of places like East and West Francia, which will become Germany and France, respectively. We see the emergence of England from the old Roman province. We see the emergence of France. So we see all the, and then there's other countries like Italy and such, obviously. But because of the collapse of the Roman Empire and the way it collapses, we begin to see this establishment of a number of these kingdoms. The other big thing we see is constant warfare. And the constant warfare is going to matter because 1,000 years of war between these countries is going to set up for us these very important national and ethnic divides that we are going to see cause a number of major events, especially when we talked about World War I. We're going to see the importance of that and how the legacy of the past plays into that. Now, critically, guys, it's also worth being aware that Islam is the last of what is today the major religions. Keep in mind there were massive religions of the past that still exist, but they're very small. They're practiced by only a couple million people, whereas comparison you have about 1 billion Christians, about 1 billion Muslims, and somewhere around like 2 billion Buddhists. So Islam is the last of the major religions, and critically, it's worth being aware, especially when we talk about like the Ottoman Empire and its collapse, as well as the treatment of the Middle East. It's important in Africa during the colonial periods. It's important you guys are aware that the way we think of the Middle East and Africa today is very much not what it was like in the past. So there was a series of golden ages where the Middle East and Africa had some of the wealthiest, most powerful empires in the world. And there were periods where there were African nations that were far wealthier than Europe, where a single man had more money than an entire country in Europe. So it's important that we don't think of these places as always having been exploited and war-torn. They had these golden ages. It just so happens that the period we're talking about is after these have happened. Lastly, please remember, guys, that while China in the ancient period had been incredibly wealthy and powerful and technologically advanced, by the medieval period, we see that change. So when China is going to enter the picture for us in the 1800s, it's critical to know that China, a once powerful and glorious empire, I use the word enjoy, but really it suffered dozens of cycles of civil war, golden age, civil war, golden age, and over the centuries, it's taken its toll. And by the time we get to China, they're going to be in a period of stagnation. Same thing with Japan. Japan had never been a particularly important country, but they had always been a fiercely independent one. And they had been a warrior society, and people always love learning about them. But by the time we get to them again in 1850s, they're going to be much like China, a backwards, stagnated country, where once they've been advanced as well, that will have changed. All right, so the last important thing, as my son does disco lights in the background, and I have about 30 seconds here, what's going to kick off our modern world era is a period called the Renaissance, the rebirth, where we see the knowledge of Greece and Rome. It had never truly completely disappeared, but it comes back to importance. And this is the period from about 1500 to 1750 where Europe, having been behind for 1,000 years of the Middle East, Africa, and China, they actually begin to emerge finally as the center of wealth, knowledge, and power. And that's going to take us to where we begin.